Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. My name is Reepiron, and today we're going to be going over the Demo Advanced Guide. So I'm going to be telling you two different builds for Demo. Unfortunately, Demo only really has two different builds depending on the weapons that you're using, as well as 5 different loadouts for Demo. So let's start out with the first build and then talk about the second build as well. So the first build I'd recommend is just the all damage build. This one's pretty straightforward. You're just going for the most amount of damage with your weapons, and this is kind of the best overall build, I would say, for Demo. So at level 5, we're going to go with Bombardier. This just gives us 25% more damage, which is what we want. We just want the most amount of damage. At level 10, we're going to take High Impact Rounds. This makes it so we get 25% more damage when we directly hit any of the enemies with any of our weapons, which is, again, what we want. We want more damage. At level 15, we take Sonic Resist Rounds. This just makes it so sirens no longer affect us. We can use our explosives on them even if they're screaming. This also works for the Matriarch Scream too, so that's good. We're not going to be losing out on any of our potential damage. We're not going to be losing ammo for things like that. Then for level 20, we're going to take Armor Piercing Rounds. This makes it so if we direct hit any enemies in their critical spot, then we do an additional 50% damage, which is nice. Usually that's the head for most things. Certain enemies have multiple weak spots, like how the King Fleshbound has a weak spot on his head as well as his chest. This will also work similarly to Husks, where if you hit him in the head, it'll do bonus damage, or in the backpack, it will do bonus damage. Hans is the same way too, head or chest. Anyway, we just want more damage, that's why we're taking this one. And then at our level 25, if we had that unlocked, I would recommend taking Destroyer of Worlds. This makes it so when Z-Time triggers, we just set off nukes pretty much, destroying everything. This is one of the strongest Z-Time perks in the entire game. Mad Bomber is pretty good too with certain weapons. Weapons like the grenade launchers or the gravity imploder are particularly good with Mad Bomber. Almost everything else is better with Destroyer of Worlds, and I would recommend that one. Even something like the RPG, which could use both, I would still probably recommend Destroyer of Worlds with that. So that's the first build. It's pretty straightforward. You just take everything on the left side. Don't have to think about it. Just it works with pretty much all of your weapons. The second build is more situational for certain weapons. I would recommend taking Shock Trooper as well as Fragmentation Rounds, but keeping the rest the same, and then maybe taking Mad Bomber depending on which weapons you take. Shock Trooper gives you faster reloads, and that's what you mostly want. It'll also increase your knockdown power. Knockdown power you don't really need to worry about all that much. Just the faster reloads can help with certain weapons, especially like the M32 grenade launcher, where it holds 6 shots and you need to reload it, and it reloads very slow. Shock Trooper will help you out with those weapons. It'll make every weapon feel a little bit more snappy. You will be missing out on the damage from Bombardier, but some of those weapons, like the M32, can really make use of much better use of the Shock Trooper than other weapons. At level 10, we're going to go with High Impact Rounds. Extra rounds don't really help you a whole lot as Demo. Adding 5 more ammo is not going to be as useful as dealing 25% more damage on direct hits. That's just how it's going to be. At level 15, I would recommend Fragmentation Rounds for this. You could go with Sonic Resist Rounds if you want, but Fragmentation Rounds give you the most AoE damage. This can be really good with the grenade launchers. It can destroy a lot of enemies very quickly. Especially in wide open maps. I would recommend this much more in wide open maps than in closed maps. If you're playing in Catacombs or the Descent or Voltaire Manor, anything that has small areas, I would definitely recommend against taking Fragmentation Rounds with most weapons. It won't matter so much if you're taking the grenade pistol or the Kaboom stick because you can't hurt yourself with them, but you definitely can hurt yourself with the grenade launchers very easily. Armor Piercing Rounds for level 20, just more damage. That's what we want. The concussion rounds aren't super useful. Increased stumble and stun chance and knockdown power is not way great. We want to be killing things more than just knocking them around. And then, again, you could take Destroyer of Worlds, or you could go with Mad Bomber with this if you're taking this with the Gravity Imploder, because the Gravity Imploder can make pretty good use of the Fragmentation Rounds, just giving you a really big radius to hit everything in, and you can't really damage yourself with it. So, Mad Bomber is pretty good with that one. It's also pretty good with the grenade launchers, like I said. So I'll just be going with this build, and then I'm going to switch over to the other builds as I recommend different weapons for you to take. So let's get into a game and discuss some of Demo's strengths, weaknesses, and just generally how to play them. Alright, starting out the match with Demo, we do start out with our grenade pistol. We also got our knife and 9mm like every other class. And we have our dynamite. Now, the starting phases for demo are probably going to be some of the hardest ones for you, because the grenade pistol does have limited ammo. And with that limited ammo, it can be pretty difficult if there's crowds of enemies, especially if they can surround you from all sides. A tip that I would give to anybody that's wanting to play demo on higher difficulties is get used to bashing with the guns. This will help save ammo quite a bit, and it will also allow you to get not only kills from hitting headshots, but you can potentially just keep bashing Zeds backward into multiple groups of them. So even if you're hitting them in the arms or something like that, once you get 2 or 3 together or even more, then try to hit them with the grenade pistol and do a lot of damage to them. You can usually kill them quite easily. Big enemies like this, your grenade pistol might not be the best. You might want to switch over to the 9mm. Because as you can see, hitting a bloat multiple times, even with this full damage build, does take quite a few shots with it. So it can be a bit difficult there. You also might not have the most money starting out. And and demo also has no additional tankiness, no additional mobility. You don't get any bonus health, you don't get any bonus armor. Armor isn't too bad to get early on, but as you can see, most of your early weapons aren't particularly the strongest. C4 is really strong, but you don't get very many of it. You have a high chance of blowing yourself up. And something like the M79 grenade launcher is also pretty strong, but you do need room. You can also injure yourself pretty easily with it. So it might actually just be best to keep the grenade pistol. Now, if you're below, I believe, 7 or 8, somewhere around there, in terms of ammo, it's actually cheaper just to sell your pistol and buy a new pistol back, simply because you'll get more ammo that way. You may also want to consider getting a pistol from Gunslinger as well, or a strong weapon like the Winchester from Sharpshooter. Pistols are pretty cheap. You can get something like the 1911 very cheap, and it's a pretty good all-around pistol for dealing with small things early on. You could go with a Desert Eagle that's very powerful and deals with most things, but does have a good amount of recoil, so you do have to be aware of that. Or you could potentially even go with something like a 500 if you want to have a lot more damage and pretty high accuracy. Alright, so our first build and the most simple build for demo is going with the Kaboom stick and literally anything else. The Kaboom stick is probably your best overall weapon at the moment. It's incredibly powerful. It's very, very strong at close range. It can do an absurd amount of damage with its secondary fire. This weapon also gives you bonus mobility. If you use its secondary fire while you jump, you can fire both barrels with its secondary fire. To do this, it's mouse wheel press if you're on mouse and keyboard. If you're on controller, it's usually right bumper. This will send you backward, flying, so you can actually get out of the way of certain grabs by enemies like Hans. This weapon also cannot injure you, which is really good. And it is extremely devastating at very close range against really everything. There's no real advanced technique for this, just wait for enemies to get very close and then blast them with it. Mostly use its regular fire just to kill small things. Save its secondary fire for things like Scrakes, Flesh Pounds, anything like that, bosses. The second loadout I would recommend for demo with this list would be these two weapons. The M16 paired with the Seal Squeal. The Seal Squeal has incredibly high damage and can set up very deadly zones for your team, thanks to its harpoons. It does a lot of damage towards bosses. It's one of your best boss killing weapons. And you can sometimes leave mines in the ground for enemies to be close to. Like these crawlers here. You can potentially leave them in the crawlers like that, or you can set them off with your secondary fire, which does a large AoE blast that kills a lot of small things very easily. It also works very well against things like Flesh Pounds, just like most of your weapons really do. You can also set this off even if you see enemies coming when you want to reload. So it's a pretty strong weapon for that. However, this weapon does sit at kind of an odd weight at 7. Its upgrades do make it a lot stronger, which is pretty nice. It doesn't necessarily need upgrades, but there is one thing that you have to keep in mind, and that is that you can hurt yourself with the explosions. So be careful with this weapon. I would still recommend the same build, which is just all the left side perks for this. This weapon doesn't really need the extra reload speed, and it doesn't really need the extra explosion radius. Certain maps can kind of be useful for that. And then your M16 is just a well-rounded overall weapon for demo, where you can use the assault rifle part on it to be pretty accurate the same way you do with commando. And of course the secondary is the grenade launcher. It's important to know that most of your perks don't affect the machine gun part of this. Like your reloading perk only affects the grenade launcher part, not the assault rifle part of it. The M16 scales alright too with upgrades. It doesn't really need them, but it's not bad to have them. With this loadout, you can upgrade the seal squeal all the way, and that's probably what I would recommend, is upgrading that one, keeping the M16 as base. You're going to be using mostly the M16 for small enemies, and as a backup weapon if you potentially run out of shots with your seal squeal, which you can do. You want to be using the seal squeal against large enemies and large crowds as much as possible. And then the M16 against small enemies that are trickling in. One of the main skills that you're probably going to want to learn with demo is distancing. What distance can you get away with where your explosions aren't going to hurt you, at least too much, and you can still harm enemies from, or what distance does it take for your weapons to arm? Alright, my third build I'd recommend for demo is this, the RPG with C4 and a Desert Eagle. The RPG is your highest damaging single shot weapon, or I guess... yeah, I guess that's a decent way of putting it. It does a huge amount of damage, it has a pretty big explosion radius, and it can do a ton of damage to anything that you hit in the crit zone because it does have a pretty small projectile. The Desert Eagle works as a pretty good backup. If you have to run around and gun, you do have this option. And then of course you do have your C4 as well, which you can toss out and then set to detonate. You can also stick it to things like walls and set it off. Couple tricks with the C4, you don't want to be too close to it when it goes off. As I stated, it does do a lot of damage to you. You don't have too many of them, so you don't want to use them up too often. And if there's any enemy that you hit multiple times with, you want to pace out your C4s. You don't want to stick them all to one target and then set them off one after another as quickly as possible. Also, if you throw out multiple C4s, it won't set them all off at once. It'll set them off one at a time. One trick you can also do with C4, if you're against the Patriarch, is that you can stick these C4s to him. And then once he eventually runs away to heal, you can set them off and deal damage to him. So we're going to try doing that this time. Just going to try to hit him with the RPG as much as I can. Get the distances just right. And hopefully not just blow him up. Although you will want to make sure that you have enough damage on him to hurt him. So when he's running away like this, you can set them off and kill him. I think that counted as me hitting it twice, because I still have one C4 active. And I stuck 3 to him. So you can blow him up like that. It is kind of funny. It's actually a pretty decent technique if he keeps running away from you. Try to stick some C4 to him. But like I said, make sure your explosions are spaced out. So when he starts running away, set one off. And then set as many others off, but not in quick succession like this. Make sure that it's 1, wait a little bit, 2, wait a little bit, set off another one. That way you're doing the most amount of damage, because C4 does drop off in damage if you do set them off all at once. Alright, for this next build, I recommend going with both the grenade launchers. This will take up all of your weight, and this is just an AoE denial build. So with this one, I would recommend taking Shock Trooper and Fragmentation rounds. You can go with Sonic Resist rounds if you find that one more useful, or if you're playing on an indoor map, which I wouldn't recommend this build on an indoor map. I would definitely recommend this on a very large outdoor map. And like I said, this is just to deny as much area as possible. So this is going with the M32 and the M79 grenade launchers. You have a single shot with the M79 and 6 shots with the M32. If any enemies get close, you will either have to hit them with the grenade manually, or you will need to bash them out of the way. You're going to want to try to keep as much distance as possible, and just try to have long lines of sight to enemies. It might even be best to just ignore enemies coming right at you, and hopefully let your team take care of them. I find jumping also helps with this, because if you jump, it's a little bit closer to, at least it's easier for me to aim for the ground then, and try to hit enemies. This does have a really high amount of damage per second that it can output. It's also extremely strong if you have the Destroyer of Worlds perk and Z time is triggered. You probably want to shoot the M32 grenade launcher as much as you can at longer ranges. Then if enemies start closing in and you have to run around, probably switch to the M79 just so you get this one shot that deals a decent amount of damage. And you have fairly fast reloads.
You're going down.
Of course, this loadout is extremely forgiving on your accuracy. You do not need to be the most accurate person in the world, but this does drop off damage quite a bit against large enemies. This is much better used against waves of small enemies. As you've seen, it can knock things down and it can kill strikes and flesh pounds pretty easily, but not nearly as easily as something like your RPG or your Kaboom stick can do. And you can kind of see just how far away you can actually still get hurt by this. That's still a pretty decent distance where I'm still taking damage from it. So this is another kind of dangerous build for you to be using. Actually, this is probably one of your most dangerous builds to be using, because both your weapons don't kill anything at close range very quickly because you're just not going to be able to set off the explosives. You can't use this really in like an indoor map area like this. So if your team wants to set up here, you know, the best you can do is probably aim down there. This actually is probably one of the better indoor areas, but if for whatever reason you decided to sit up here and try to shoot enemies, you know, just coming up this ramp, it's going to be more difficult for you. It won't be so bad hitting enemies throughout here, but you can just imagine if you're inside catacombs or another map like that that has really enclosed walls and ceilings, that you just be bumping your head on everything, and it'd be really difficult to use your grenade launchers. Alright, the next loadout I would recommend is something like this, with the Kaboom stick and the Husk cannon. Again, I said you can pair the Kaboom stick with anything, this is just why I picked as a secondary, and using the Husk cannon as your primary weapon. So, since we've already talked about the Kaboom stick, let's talk about the Husk cannon. So this weapon can be used two ways, really. You can either use it to spam fire and hit enemies very quickly with its rapid fire. This works pretty well against small enemies, as you've seen there. It can work pretty well against medium enemies and even large enemies to an extent. You can shoot it very quickly. This is, by the way, going with the whole damage build as well. Or you can charge it up to deal one big blast of damage to enemies. Both of these are good. The charge shot I would recommend using more for things like husks and... not husks. Strikes and flesh pounds. That's usually where you want to be using this, where the smaller fire you want to be using against pretty much everything else. If you want a full, just general purpose loadout against everything, I would probably recommend taking this with something like the M16, just so then you don't really have any weaknesses. The M16 works very well against small things and big things the same way this weapon does, so if you run out with one of the weapons, you can always switch to the other one and use that. As you can see, it works just fine at denying areas. And then the last loadout, I'm going to pick a strange one, which is the Seeker 6 with the Pulverizer. The Pulverizer should always be, if you're going to take it, should always be taken as the second weapon that you take, not your primary weapon, not the weapon you're going to use. It doesn't do particularly well on demo as a primary weapon because you don't have any bonus melee stuff. It's mostly just the raw amount of damage you're going to be dealing with its heavy attack. But it does give you a lot of defense, and that's really what you're going to want it for. Now the Seeker 6, this could have honestly been switched out with something like the M16 or the RPG, really any other demo weapon if you want to just be more safe. Kaboom stick and I think like the M16 and Seeker 6 would probably be your safest options. The Seeker 6 sometimes gets a bad reputation that's not entirely earned. The Seeker 6's lock-on system can't be used all that well in most open maps, simply because there just isn't enough room to use it. You need room to fire this, and a lot of the time you're just going to be firing the Seeker 6 the way that I'm firing it here. On longer maps like Nuked, and especially Elysium, the Seeker 6 can actually be pretty good. Any long area where you can acquire multiple targets with this and then fire it is going to make this weapon much easier because you're never going to be overusing ammo at all. The Seeker 6 can't injure you though, which is pretty nice. Same with the Pulverizer, cannot injure you, and they do decently well against crowds. They also do pretty well against large enemies. I would definitely recommend using the Seeker 6 the majority of the time against most enemies, and then switching over to the Pulverizer to do high amounts of damage with the big hit, or if you need to block, more likely. Because its light hits, yeah, they can work against small enemies, and its heavy hits do work decently well against things like armoreds. But mostly it's going to be for its defensive use. If you have things like flesh pounds and scrapes coming up to hit you, you're definitely going to want this out, because it can just prevent them from hitting you, at least as hard. If you're pretty well skilled as Berserker too, or even Medic using like a Hemoclobber, then using the Pulverizer shouldn't really be all that difficult for you to do. Alright, so that'll do it for Demo. Demo is a very fun class to play. They are an extremely strong class to play, but they are a very risky class to play too. You don't have any bonus mobility, tankiness, anything like that, as I've already stressed a couple of times in this video. You also do a ton of damage, just a metric ton of damage if you hit something with like your RPG, or even like the grenade launcher can do a surprisingly high amount of damage. So you do have that going for you. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. Thank you guys also very much for coming out. I really do appreciate it. If you're new here, consider subscribing. That way you get notifications whenever I post any of these videos. And I will see all of you guys next time. Till then, stay cool and bye!